I bought a shack to bury my past, but the lonely widow next door made me want to live again. Ethan Drake stepped out of the small transport pod and let the cold wind hit his face. The asteroid was nothing like Earth. Its sky was a dark gray, swirling with dust storms, and the ground beneath his boots was cracked and jagged. He looked around at the endless stretches of rocky terrain. This was exactly what he wanted. Loneliness. He wanted to disappear from the world, to bury the memories that haunted him every day. He had bought a small shack here, an old building that had been abandoned for years. Its wood was gray and cracked, and the metal roof was rusted, but to Ethan, it felt perfect. He didn't need comfort. He didn't need anyone. He just needed silence. As he unlocked the shack's door, the smell of dust and old wood filled his nose. He stepped inside and let his bag fall to the floor. There was barely any furniture, a broken chair, a small table, and a bed frame with no mattress. It was perfect, empty, silent. He could imagine himself sitting here for days, maybe weeks, without talking to another soul. Ethan sank onto the floor, letting his back rest against the wall. His thoughts drifted to the mission he wanted to forget. He had been part of a team sent to explore a newly discovered planet on the outer edge of human space. The mission had gone horribly wrong. His crew had died, one by one, in ways he couldn't erase from his mind. He had escaped, but the cost had been heavy. Every night he saw their faces in his dreams. Every day he felt the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. "This is why I'm here," he muttered to himself, away from everyone, away from the past. Outside, the wind howled, carrying tiny rocks and dust in sharp swirls. Ethan didn't bother to close the windows fully. He wanted the harshness of the asteroid to remind him that he was exploring every corner, that he was still human. In one corner, he found an old chest. It was empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a few broken tools. He smiled faintly. At least someone had lived here before. Someone had tried. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Ethan built a small fire in the shack's old fireplace. The flames flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange calm. He didn't need anyone. He didn't want anyone. That was the plan. But as he stared into the fire, he thought he saw movement outside the window. He froze. A shadow, tall and thin, moved near the neighboring shack. Ethan frowned. He hadn't seen anyone arrive. The area was supposed to be empty. He grabbed a small flashlight from his bag and crept outside. The wind cut against his face, but he kept moving toward the shadow. When he reached the edge of his property, he saw a figure, an older woman, moving carefully, her face hidden under a hood. She carried a small bag and seemed to be tending to something near her door. Ethan stepped back. He hadn't expected anyone. He had bought this place for solitude. But there was something about her, something familiar in the way she moved. Cautious, careful, but strong. She seemed alive in a way he had forgotten how to be. He turned back to his shack, trying to push the thought away. He didn't need distractions. He didn't need anyone. He had survived alone for so long, and he would continue to do so. The next few days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Ethan explored the area, scavenged what he could from the rocky terrain, and worked to make the shack livable. He repaired the roof a little, patched up holes in the walls, and cleared some of the dust. Every night he lit the fire and sat in silence, thinking of nothing but the cold wind outside. But he couldn't ignore the woman next door. He had learned her name was Maris Velen from a small note pinned to her door. She rarely came out, but when she did, she moved with purpose, tending small crops in artificial soil containers and checking traps she had set for alien creatures that wandered too close. Ethan watched from a distance, fascinated. She was alone, yet she thrived. She had adapted to this harsh environment in ways he had only imagined. One evening, a storm hit the asteroid. The winds were stronger than anything Ethan had felt before. Dust and rocks battered his shack, and he realized his repairs were barely enough to keep it standing. He peeked out the window and saw Maris struggling with a large container she had left outside. Without thinking, he ran to help her.
"Here, let me help," he shouted over the wind. Maris turned, surprised, but didn't refuse.
Together, they secured the container, bracing it against the ground so it wouldn't be swept away. In those moments, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: connection. A spark that reminded him he was human, that he wasn't meant to live completely alone. After the storm passed, they shared a quiet moment outside their shacks. Maris looked at him, her eyes calm and steady despite the chaos around them. "You're new here," she said simply. "I guess you could say that," Ethan replied. "Just needed a place to think." Maris nodded. "This place can do that. But it also reminds you that you're alive. That's something, isn't it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the jagged horizon, thinking about her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe solitude wasn't enough. Maybe surviving didn't just mean staying alive. It meant feeling alive again. The next morning, Ethan woke early. He watched Maris tending to her small crops again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of hope. He didn't know what it meant yet, but something was changing inside him. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself helping Maris more often, securing traps, collecting water from distant reservoirs, and even repairing small devices that had broken. They didn't speak much about their pasts. They didn't need to. Their actions, their cooperation, said enough. And slowly, Ethan began to notice things about Maris that made him smile quietly to himself. The way she laughed softly when a small alien creature wandered too close. The careful way she repaired broken tools. The strength in her eyes, even when she was tired. She reminded him that life could still be beautiful, even on a cold, desolate asteroid. One evening, as they watched the twin suns set behind jagged cliffs, Ethan finally spoke. "Why do you stay here?" he asked. Maris looked at him, eyes thoughtful. "Because someone has to. Because this place needs people who can survive. And maybe because it gives me a reason to keep going." Ethan nodded slowly. He realized that he felt the same way now, though he hadn't admitted it to himself. He had come here to bury his past, to escape from memories that hurt too much. But now, standing beside Maris, he understood that running away wasn't the answer. Living, surviving, and connecting, that was what mattered. That night, as he lay on the floor of his shack, he stared at the ceiling and felt a strange warmth in his chest. He was still alone, but no longer lonely. Something had shifted. The shack wasn't just a place to hide anymore. It was a place to begin again. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Drake allowed himself to hope. Outside, the wind whispered through the jagged rocks, carrying with it the distant echo of alien wildlife. The stars above shone cold and bright, and somewhere nearby in the small shack next door, a lonely widow was living, surviving, and unknowingly bringing life back to a man who thought he was dead inside. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the silence, and for the first time, he smiled. The morning sun rose over the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky surface of the asteroid. Ethan Drake stepped outside his shack, stretching his arms and feeling the cold, dry wind against his skin. The solitude he had sought was still here, but it no longer felt heavy. Something had changed. Maris Velen was already outside, tending to her small hydroponic garden. She moved carefully, placing seedlings into small containers filled with nutrient-rich soil. The alien sun above glinted off her tools, and Ethan noticed how precise her movements were. She had adapted to this harsh environment in ways that amazed him. "Morning!" Ethan called, trying not to startle her. Maris glanced up and gave a small, polite smile. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Ethan admitted, watching her work. "You? Do this every day?" Maris nodded without looking up. "It keeps me alive, keeps me busy. Helps me remember who I am." Ethan frowned slightly. He understood that feeling too well. He had spent so many nights haunted by memories he didn't want, trying to forget who he had been. Maybe Maris had her own ghosts. They worked in silence for a while. Ethan repaired a small water container while Maris tended her plants. Then, without warning, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Ethan froze. Maris immediately dropped to the ground, eyes scanning the rocky horizon. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. "Stay down," she said quietly. "Something's coming." The rumble grew louder. Ethan squinted toward the distant cliffs and saw movement, large, irregular shapes moving fast across the rocky terrain. Alien scavengers. He recognized them from reports, intelligent predators that had evaded human colonies for decades. They were scavengers, but they weren't mindless. They were cunning, adaptable, and deadly. "They've never been this close," Ethan muttered. Maris's eyes narrowed. "They're hungry, and they've learned to hunt near human settlements. We'll need to defend ourselves." Ethan's heart raced. He had fought dangerous creatures before, but these scavengers were different. They weren't just physical threats. They were smart. They studied, adapted, and learned. But Ethan had something even they didn't: human intelligence and strategy. He and Maris quickly moved to secure the area. Ethan checked the shack, reinforcing doors and windows with broken metal panels. Maris set up traps, pits covered with thin rock plates, small nets triggered by tripwires, and containers filled with loud flashing devices meant to startle the creatures. "You think this will work?" Ethan asked, doubt creeping into his voice. Maris shook her head slightly. "It might not, but humans survive because we adapt. Watch, learn, and act. That's our advantage." The scavengers approached cautiously, their multiple limbs moving with strange, fluid grace. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. These weren't animals in the usual sense. They were predators with intelligence. They seemed to study every movement, every shadow. The first scavenger tripped a tripwire and fell into a pit. It screeched, thrashing violently, and the others froze, uncertain. Ethan and Maris used the moment to push small flashing devices near the remaining creatures. Bright lights and high-pitched sounds disoriented them, but only temporarily. "They're learning," Ethan said, eyes narrowing. "They're figuring us out." Maris nodded. "Then we need to stay ahead." Humans don't just fight with strength. We fight with brains, with creativity. Together they lured the creatures toward a narrow canyon. Ethan used his knowledge of tactical maneuvers honed during years in off-world missions to plan their path. Maris added small hazards along the way: rocks rigged to fall, traps to trip them, and even small containers filled with spicy alien plants that would irritate their senses. The scavengers fell for the trap. One by one, they became caught in the pits, tangled in nets, or driven back by the irritants. Ethan and Maris moved silently, efficiently, a team that had never spoken much, but understood each other instinctively. When the last scavenger finally fled, Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. His heart pounded, but there was a thrill in surviving, in overcoming a danger that seemed unstoppable. "You did well," Maris said, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the creatures. "Better than I expected." "You too," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the compliment. "You're smart. Very smart." Maris smiled faintly. Humans have to be, especially in places like this. For the first time, Ethan felt a deep respect and something more for the woman beside him. She was more than just a neighbor. She was a survivor, a strategist, someone who had learned to thrive when most would have given up. Over the next few days, Ethan and Maris worked together more closely. He repaired broken equipment, helped with water collection, and even began learning her techniques for managing the alien environment. In return, she shared knowledge about the local creatures and plants, teaching him how to avoid danger and use the land to their advantage. Slowly, trust grew between them. Ethan began to talk about small things, his routines, what he liked to eat, how he kept his mind occupied. Maris listened quietly, offering advice without judgment. It was the first time he had spoken to someone without fear of their opinion or pity. One evening, after another long day of work, they sat outside their shacks watching the twin suns sink below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the alien rocks glowing softly in the fading light. "You've changed," Maris said suddenly. "Since you arrived, you seem lighter." Ethan frowned. "I don't know about that. I'm just surviving." "Surviving isn't enough," she said. "Humans do more than survive. We fight, we create, we connect." "You're starting to remember that." Ethan looked at her, unsure if he was ready to admit it, even to himself. But there was truth in her words. He had come here to hide from the past, but in helping her, in facing danger together, he had begun to feel alive again. The next challenge came faster than expected. A second group of scavengers appeared, larger and more aggressive than the first. This time, they weren't just hunting for food. They were searching for humans. Their intelligence was frightening. They studied the traps from the first attack, avoiding them with surprising skill. Ethan and Maris had to act quickly. Using a combination of strategy and improvisation, they led the scavengers into a narrow canyon filled with jagged rocks and sharp drops. Ethan rigged a series of controlled collapses, while Maris prepared irritant plants along the path. The battle was tense. Ethan fought alongside Maris, their movements synchronized. He realized that for the first time in years he was not afraid, not because he was fearless, but because he was part of a team. He was part of something larger than himself, something human. By the end of the day, the scavengers were gone, some dead, some driven off. Ethan was exhausted, but exhilarated. He looked at Maris, who was equally tired but smiling. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "Not amazing," she replied. "Human. That's all it takes." Ethan felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Human. Not alone. Not broken. Just alive. That night, as he lay on the floor of his shack, he thought about the past weeks. He had arrived to hide from the world, to bury himself in loneliness. Instead, he had found something unexpected, a connection, a reason to fight, a reminder that humans could survive anything, not just because of strength, but because of intelligence, creativity, and cooperation. He thought about Maris, her resilience, her calm in the face of danger. He realized that part of him wanted to stay, not just for safety, but because he wanted to be near someone who reminded him what it meant to live. Outside, the wind whispered through the rocks. The stars above glimmered cold and bright. The asteroid was harsh, unforgiving, and yet full of life. strange, alien life that challenged humans at every turn. And humans, Ethan realized, were meant to rise to that challenge, to adapt, to survive, to thrive. Ethan closed his eyes, thinking about the battles, the scavengers, the nights spent repairing shacks and setting traps, and he understood something he hadn't before. Survival was not enough. Humans didn't just endure. They overcame. They fought back. They learned. They lived. And beside him in the small shack next door, a lonely widow was living, surviving, and unknowingly teaching a man who had given up on life what it truly meant to be human. For the first time, Ethan Drake felt hope, not just for himself, but for what humans could do, even in the most hostile corners of the universe. And he knew that the next challenge, whatever it was, would not be faced alone. The days passed slowly on the barren asteroid, but each day brought new challenges. Ethan Drake and Maris Velen had settled into a rhythm, collecting water from distant ice reservoirs, maintaining the shacks, tending to Maris's hydroponic garden, and repairing old machinery left from a long-abandoned colony. Despite the routine, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The scavengers they had faced before had only been scouts. Their attacks were clever, but not enough to destroy humans. They had been testing them, learning their methods. Ethan knew instinctively that the real threat was still out there, watching, waiting. Maris, as usual, seemed calm. She moved with quiet efficiency, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain for any sign of danger. "They're planning," she said one morning, as she examined tracks in the dust. "They've learned from the last encounter. Next time, they'll come in force." Ethan frowned. "Force? How many are we talking about?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed to a wide valley in the distance. Too many to fight head-on. But humans, we don't fight head-on either. We adapt. We improvise. That's our advantage." He nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Humans survived where others failed because of their intelligence, creativity, and cooperation. And right now, that was all they had. Over the next week, they prepared. Ethan reinforced the shacks, setting up barricades and hidden shelters. Maris rigged the area with traps, spiked pits, tripwires, and noise-making devices. She even trained small alien creatures captured from nearby caves to act as early warning alarms. Each night, they tested their defenses, learning how to move silently, how to react quickly. Despite the danger, Ethan felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. He and Maris worked together seamlessly. Their communication was unspoken at times. A glance, a gesture, a shared understanding. He found himself respecting her more with each passing day. She wasn't just strong, she was brilliant, resourceful, and fiercely human in the best ways. One afternoon, while checking one of the distant traps, Ethan noticed unusual movement. A group of scavengers was approaching, larger than the previous ones. At least a dozen strong, their limbs long and angular, their heads moving as if scanning for weaknesses. They were smarter than before, moving cautiously to avoid traps. Ethan's heart raced. He ran back to Maris, warning her. "They're here. They're coming fast, and they know what to avoid." Maris didn't panic. She quickly grabbed a communicator and activated a small signal flare. "We'll draw them into the canyon," she said. "They'll underestimate what humans can do." Ethan followed her as she led the way to a narrow canyon between jagged cliffs. She explained her plan as they ran. "We use their intelligence against them. We make them think they're hunting us. We guide them, mislead them, and trap them where we want." Ethan nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "And if they figure it out?" Maris smiled faintly. "Then we improvise. Humans survive by thinking faster, acting smarter, and never giving up. As the scavengers entered the canyon, Ethan and Maris triggered a series of traps. Rocks fell from above, blocking escape routes. Small pits with hidden spikes caught the first creatures, and irritant plants released clouds of fine dust that made breathing difficult for the scavengers. The creatures screamed in frustration, but they adapted quickly, trying to climb out or find another path. Ethan and Maris moved silently along the edges of the canyon, using rocks and debris for cover. They had set up pressure-sensitive plates that would trigger nets and alarms. The scavengers fell for some of them, but avoided others. It was a tense game of strategy, each side learning from the other. Suddenly, one of the scavengers leapt toward Ethan, its multiple limbs snapping like whips. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. Maris fired a small energy net, wrapping the creature and holding it down. Together, they pushed it into a pit. "Good work," Ethan panted, looking at her.
You really think like a soldier? Maris shook her head. No.
"I think like a human. Humans survive by being smarter, by learning faster, by working together. That's what makes us stronger than anything else out there." Ethan felt a surge of pride. He had thought he was done with fighting, done with surviving. But here, with Maris, he realized that being human meant more than endurance. It meant ingenuity, creativity, and cooperation. The scavengers kept coming, more determined and cautious than ever. Ethan and Maris used everything at their disposal, rocks, traps, even small, controlled explosions, to guide the creatures through a gauntlet of hazards. It was exhausting, dangerous, and exhilarating. Hours passed. By nightfall, the canyon was littered with the injured or trapped scavengers. The remaining creatures, realizing they were outmatched, retreated into the shadows of the asteroid. Ethan and Maris stood together, panting, covered in dust and sweat, but victorious. "You see," Mary said, her eyes shining, "humans adapt. Humans survive. We don't just react. We plan, we think, we fight smarter than anything else." Ethan nodded. He had felt that truth deep in his bones during the battle. Humans were not the strongest creatures on the asteroid. They were not the fastest, but they were the smartest, the most adaptable, the most relentless. That was what made them unbeatable. Over the following days, Ethan and Maris tended to the canyon, removing hazards that could backfire and reinforcing their defenses. They also spent time repairing their shacks and equipment. Despite the exhaustion, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. One evening, as they watched the twin suns set, Ethan spoke quietly. "I came here to hide, to forget. I didn't think I'd find this. Working together, surviving, feeling alive again." Maris looked at him, her eyes calm and steady. "You didn't find it. You remembered it. Humans never forget how to survive, how to fight, how to live. You just needed a reason." Ethan smiled faintly. "And you gave me that reason." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the distant cliffs. "Look, the scavengers are cautious now. They've learned. But they're not gone. They'll come back, bigger and smarter. And next time, we'll be ready." Ethan felt a thrill of anticipation. He wasn't afraid anymore. Facing danger with Maris had reminded him of something fundamental. Humans could overcome anything, not because of strength alone, but because of intelligence, creativity, and determination. The next morning, they set out to expand their defenses. Ethan repaired old energy generators while Maris rigged more traps and reinforced the shacks. They also began mapping the asteroid terrain, marking potential ambush sites, resource points, and safe zones. Every action was planned, calculated, and executed with precision. During one break, Ethan watched Maris carefully. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" he asked. Maris nodded. "Long enough to learn how to survive. Long enough to know that humans, even alone, can find ways to thrive. But it's better when we work together." Ethan realized she was teaching him more than survival. She was teaching him what it meant to be human, to connect, to care, to fight not just for oneself but for others. Days turned into weeks. The scavengers tested their defenses repeatedly, each time learning, adapting, but always facing the clever, relentless human response. Ethan and Maris became a well-oiled team, understanding each other without words, moving with precision, thinking ahead. One night after another successful defense, they sat outside their shacks. Ethan felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The asteroid was still harsh, still dangerous, but it was theirs. And together, they could survive anything. "You know," Ethan said, looking at the distant stars, "I think I'm ready for whatever comes next." Maris smiled faintly. "Humans are always ready. We survive, we fight, we adapt, and we thrive where others fail. That's who we are." Ethan nodded, understanding fully for the first time. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about being human, thinking, learning, innovating, connecting. That was the true strength. And somewhere in the distance, hidden among the jagged rocks, the scavengers were watching, learning, and preparing for their next move. But Ethan and Maris were ready. Together they had proven that human ingenuity and resilience could overcome any threat. Ethan looked at Maris, and for the first time, he felt more than hope. He felt certainty. Humanity could endure, adapt, and dominate even the harshest alien environments. And beside him, a lonely widow had shown him what it meant to live again. The asteroid was quiet that morning, but Ethan Drake knew better than to trust the silence. The scavengers were clever, patient, and they had learned from every encounter. Each attack had taught them something, and he knew sooner or later they would return with even greater cunning. Maris Velen was already outside her shack, inspecting the traps they had set along the canyon. Her movements were calm, methodical. Ethan admired the way she worked, her intelligence, her patience, her unwavering focus. She had survived here alone for years, and now they were a team, stronger together than apart. "They'll come back today," Maris said without looking at him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I'm ready," Ethan replied. "We've handled them before. We can do it again." Maris glanced at him briefly. "This time, we'll make them regret coming." Humans are clever, Ethan. We survive not just because we fight, but because we think. And we never stop thinking. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. Over the past weeks, they had mapped the entire area. Every canyon, every rocky ridge, every hidden crevice was marked. They had built multiple layers of traps, set up early warning systems, and reinforced their shelters. And most importantly, they had learned to predict the scavengers' movements. By mid-afternoon, the rumble began. Ethan and Maris were perched atop a rocky ridge, watching as a large group of scavengers approached. There were more than ever before, at least 20, their limbs moving with fluid, alien precision, their heads turned in unison, scanning for movement, analyzing every shadow, testing every path. "They've learned to avoid the traps," Ethan whispered. "Good," Maris replied. "That means our plan is working. They think they're smarter than us. They think they're hunting, but they're walking into our arena." The scavengers entered the canyon, their movements careful, deliberate. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't feel fear. He felt excitement. The human mind, paired with careful observation, could outmatch even the smartest predators. That was a truth he had lived over the past weeks, and now he was ready to prove it. Maris activated a small device hidden under a rock. A low hum began to emit from it, barely audible, but enough to attract the scavengers' attention. They paused, sniffing the air, moving toward the sound. Ethan signaled her, and they began the second phase of the plan. They guided the scavengers into a narrower part of the canyon, where rocks jutted out sharply, creating natural choke points. Ethan used energy nets and small, controlled explosions to funnel the creatures, forcing them to move exactly where he and Maris wanted. The predators screeched, twisted, and tried to escape, but each route led to a trap. Ethan and Maris worked in perfect harmony. He handled the technical traps, energy nets, rock falls, and tripwires, while Maris used irritant plants and trained alien creatures to herd the scavengers. Their teamwork was flawless, each anticipating the other's moves. Hours passed. The scavengers adapted again and again, but humans adapted faster. Each failed attempt by the creatures made them predictable. Ethan felt a thrill of pride, not just in himself, but in humanity. Humans could overcome anything. With creativity, intelligence, and persistence, there was no challenge too great. Finally, the last scavenger was trapped. It thrashed wildly in a pit, but it could not escape. Ethan and Maris approached cautiously, weapons at the ready, and watched it fight helplessly. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Humans," Maris said quietly, "survive because we think. Not because we are strongest, not because we are fastest, but because we learn, we plan, we adapt. That's what makes us unbeatable." Ethan nodded, feeling the truth in her words deep in his bones. They had faced a threat far greater than themselves and had prevailed, not with brute strength, but with intelligence, strategy, and cooperation. As night fell, the asteroid was silent again. Ethan and Maris returned to their shacks, exhausted but victorious. They sat outside, watching the twin suns sink below the horizon. "You know," Ethan said softly, "I thought I came here to bury myself, to forget my past. I didn't think I'd find this." He gestured to the canyon, the traps, and then at Maris. "A reason to live, a reason to fight, a reason to be human." Maris looked at him, her eyes calm but bright. "You never stopped being human, Ethan. You just forgot. Humans survive, adapt, and thrive, even in the worst places. You remembered because you had someone to survive with." Ethan realized she was right. He had come to the asteroid seeking solitude, but in helping Maris and facing danger together, he had rediscovered what it meant to live. It wasn't just survival. It was connection, purpose, and the drive to overcome. Over the next week, they repaired their shacks, strengthened their defenses, and even began exploring areas they had avoided before. They discovered small caves, hidden water sources, and even remnants of alien structures left by a long-extinct civilization. Every discovery was an opportunity to learn, to adapt, and to improve. One evening, Ethan and Maris sat together on a rocky ridge, overlooking the vast asteroid landscape. The air was cold, but the stars above sparkled brilliantly. Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think humans were fragile, weak, not meant for places like this." Maris smiled faintly. "Fragile? No. Humans are relentless. We endure, we adapt, we think, we fight, and we thrive. That's what makes us unstoppable." Ethan nodded. "And it's not just us," he added. "It's the connections we make. Alone we survive. Together we thrive." Maris placed a hand on his shoulder. Exactly. Humans are strongest when we work together. When we care, when we teach, when we learn, that's the power of being human. The asteroid was harsh, the terrain unforgiving, but for the first time, Ethan felt truly alive. He had faced death, danger, and despair, and he had overcome. Not just because of skill or strength, but because he was human. And humans, he realized, could survive and thrive anywhere in the universe. In the days that followed, they continued to reinforce their territory, mapping potential threats and finding ways to make the asteroid more livable. Ethan began teaching Maris some of his military and tactical knowledge, while she taught him her methods of survival, farming, and understanding the alien ecosystem. They shared stories, laughed quietly over small mistakes, and celebrated small victories together. Their partnership became a bond of mutual respect and admiration. Ethan realized that he was no longer trying to escape his past. Instead, he was building a future, a life where he could be strong, intelligent, and human, truly human, again. One night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan looked at Maris and spoke softly. "I thought I came here to hide. But now I know why I came, not to bury the past, but to learn how to live again." Maris smiled, her eyes reflecting the flames. "And you have. You remembered what it means to be human, to survive, to fight, to care, to live." Ethan nodded, feeling warmth in his chest. They had survived threats that seemed unbeatable, adapted to a harsh alien world, and rediscovered what it meant to be human. The asteroid was no longer a place of isolation. It was a place of triumph, growth, and beside him, a woman who had survived alone for years had shown him that life, even in the harshest places, was worth living. The night was silent, save for the faint wind and distant alien creatures stirring in the shadows. But Ethan Drake knew that no matter what threats came next, he and Maris would face them together. Humans thrived because they adapted. Humans survived because they learned. And humans, when they fought together, when they connected, could overcome any challenge the universe threw at them. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the asteroid. He felt hope, strength, and certainty. The human spirit was alive in him, stronger than ever. And somewhere nearby, the scavengers, though hidden and watching, knew that this small human enclave was no longer an easy target. Humans were clever, relentless, and unbeatable when united. Ethan smiled faintly, finally understanding the truth of what Maris had been teaching him. Survival wasn't enough. Humans thrived by thinking, adapting, connecting, and fighting together. That was the essence of humanity. That was their true strength. And together, he and Maris had proven it.